The land that this building stands on has been the site of human activity for many thousands of years. And it's important that each time we gather in this chapel, we acknowledge the original storytellers and stewards of this land. The Iowa, the Sauk, the Meskwaki, the Sioux, including the members of those people that are known as queer and two-spirited. This evening's presentation is a conversation among friends who have participated in the institutional assessment on systemic racism that FGC has supported over the last 3 years. We include representatives from the task force who gathered evidence and wrote the assessment report, and from the implementation group, whose task is to assist FGC in moving forward in becoming an anti-racist faith community. Although we will reference the report in our conversation, we will focus on what we have struggled with over these 3 years, that we have been working on the assessment and the recommendations that emerged from our exploration of the ways racism is woven into our lives as friends. We will receive question and answers period after our conversation between 9 and 9:30. It will be for people who want to stay and continue the discussion, and we realize that other people will leave at the close of the conversation at 8:45. And there are more than just the half hour after this plenary for question and answers. On Thursday afternoon and on Friday afternoon at the People of Color Center at 1:30, we have been having conversations about the assessment. We will continue that on Thursday, and on Friday we will have a session for Meeting for Worship for the Healing of Racism, which we are calling Spiritual Deepening, to combat racism. This conversation may be unsettling for many of us. The work that we have set out to do, is demanding and confusing, is chaotic, and, well, uncomfortable. It is a work in progress. We do not have all the answers. We pray that when friends leave this plenary, you will leave with questions of your own and a commitment to doing the work and understanding what we are trying to accomplish and how difficult it is, and to be committed to your own self-reflection about where white supremacy both impacts your life in ways that are both privileged and disheartening. Above all, it is my prayer that when you leave this conversation, it will inspire engagement for you of the vision of unprogrammed Quakers becoming an anti-racist faith community. As we begin, let me review some of the events where Spirit moved us to lift up this work. At the 2016 gathering held at the College of St. Benedict in St. Joseph, Minnesota, Friends of Color encountered a troubling and hostile environment upon arrival to campus and throughout most of the scheduled pre-gathering conference of Friends of Color and their families. Friends of Color were warned to avoid going into town without a companion. They were cautioned to limit town excursions to business hours. The warning was further reinforced by the actions of racial profiling by the campus security police force. Some examples: overtly following Friends of Color as they moved into and walking between the dorms. Performing surveillance on Friends of Color while preparing their campsite for the upcoming gathering. Following children of color and performing surveillance on them during playtime and walking between the dorms. After numerous reports to the staff of other incidents at the pre-gathering retreat, Friends of Color met with, and their families met with FGC staff and the clerks of the 2016 Planning Committee. During this meeting, Friends of Color shared their current experiences and also stories of other years of frustration. Stories they have been talking about for a long time, but were yet to be heard by FGC. The importance of having Friends of Color choosing sites where their significant safety concerns were honored moved FGC to reconstitute the site selection committee with a majority of Friends of Color, which is our current experience. At the same gathering, white allies distributed a petition asking FGC to conduct an institutional assessment on systemic racism in order to discover the other ways in which white supremacy culture has insinuated itself into our organization. We're going to begin our conversation tonight with an introduction of the five of us who are sitting here on this stage and who will engage in the conversation.
My name is Katrina McQuail. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm from the Lucknow Worship Group, Kitchener Area Monthly Meeting and Canadian Yearly Meeting. For me, on my journey of doing anti-racist work, the 2016 gathering was an inflection point. I was there with my co-clerk, Steve Mulkey, as we were the rising clerks for Gathering 2017. And the needs of the community were calling me forward into this anti-racism work. It fired me up. And we, as a clerking team, and I individually realized that I had a lot of work to do personally on myself in terms of engaging with white supremacy that has been ingrained in me through our culture, and also that it was really essential that as our gathering committee worked towards the 2017 gathering, that we worked to decenter whiteness in the work that we were doing together. After the 2017 gathering, I was looking for what would be next on my journey. And I was invited into the work of the institutional assessment. And so I have worked with this team and others for a year on the institutional assessment, learning, growing, stepping into bravery, making mistakes, being held in those mistakes, growing forward. And though I'm not on the implementation part of the work that's moving forward, I transitioned into doing the work of Welcoming Friend, and we have continued to incorporate anti-racism work, decentering whiteness, into the work of the Welcoming Friend project for FGC. For me, this work isn't temporary, it's lifelong, and once I recognized it and was called forward into it, I know that I will not put it down.
My name is Vanessa Julye, and I'm a member of Central Philadelphia Monthly Meeting, Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, and staff of Friends General Conference. I am a coordinator for the Committee for Nurturing Ministries, specializing in the Ministry on Racism, Youth, Institutional Assessment, and Implementation Group. So yes, as staff, especially addressing issues of racism, that it was natural that I would be a part of the not just the implementation group, but also the assessment. But it was important for me to be a part of it because I have been working around raising issues of racism within Friends General Conference and the Religious Society of Friends for 25 years. So when FGC decided that we were going to move forward with the assessment, it was clear to me that not only would I be a part of it as a staff member, but actually I was also a part of it as a full member and not just a staff person supporting the work.
My name is Carolyn Lejuste, and I am a member of Red Cedar Friends in Lansing, Michigan. My pronouns are she and her. My last name means the just or the fair. And I've done a lot of things in my life to live into that. I grew up in Detroit, Michigan, and was raised in the 50s by a father who was a World War II vet and taught me how great this country was, and taught me that anybody in this country could succeed with hard work. And as I grew up in Detroit, we had conversations around our dinner table about politics. And during the 60s, we were talking a lot about the civil rights movement. And it was quite heady. And I had the experience of a woman from Detroit who was in the civil rights action in the South who was killed. Her name was Viola Luiso. And I vividly remember that conversation around the table in my very white community, in my very white environment, about why would a white woman go and work in the civil rights movement in the South. And I think that was probably the first time I ever really had a beginning, challenging conversation about the real condition of people in this country, about how what I was taught as a child was not the truth. That the fact that my dad got to buy a house on the GI Bill and go to school, and not everybody could do that, was a stunning piece of information for me. I've worked in social justice movements most of my career. And when I retired, I thought I would continue doing it in a certain sector that I was working in, but I didn't. And when this opportunity came for me to participate in the institutional assessment, I realized that the same experience that I had learning the misguided truth, the lies of when I grew up about this country, also addressed some of the things that Quakers, some of the untruths Quakers live with. And those untruths include, there were very few Quakers who were abolitionists. And we tend to be proud of those very few Quakers, thinking that it was all of us. It was not. There were a lot of Quakers that worked in the civil rights movement in the 60s, but not really many of us. Some of us worked there. I did not. Some of us did. Maybe some in this audience did. But it was not all Quakers. And so when we have the opportunity now in this, like a second or third wave of feminism, we have another wave of working on anti-racism in this country right now. I knew that if I was going to live into my own truth, like I did as a child, I had to live into my own truth as an adult, including working, not just learning about, but thinking about ways to actively make a dent in the anti-racist paradigm that I'm hoping we will move into.
Well, my name is Sharon Lane-Getez. Sharon Lane-Getez. And yeah, sometimes I tell people soft G, because oftentimes it gets pronounced hard G, Getez or Getaz, and it's really not my fault. My name is Lane. My born name is Lane. So I never had to explain my name before. I was actually sharing that story earlier, so you were kind of nudging me. Go ahead, tell the rest.
No, I'm not going to. I just said pronouns.
Pronouns. Anyway, I wasn't going to tell the whole story.
Yeah.
Yeah, pronouns, I'm a little ambiguous with pronouns. I was born with everybody calling me she, her, hers, all that kind of stuff. I always thought that I was always a tomboy. I was a little kind of butch on the butch side, and always wished that I didn't have to automatically be all the things that people expected girls to be. So I love the fact that this younger generations, they're taking on sort of ambiguous, more fluid pronouns. I might be too old to pull off taking on these other pronouns, but I'm just saying it that way with all that complexity so that maybe others who've been there, done that, can appreciate it.
Things happen.
I think I'm dying. Okay, maybe there. That's better. Is that better? Okay, good. All right, so enough of that. I worship with Cannon Valley Friends meeting in Northfield, Minnesota, part of Northern Yearly meeting. I previously worshiped with Minneapolis Friends meeting, and I still feel very connected to both of those meetings. When I see people from those meetings, those are my people. I have no long history of being involved in civil rights. I've just been living my life, a black girl in a white world. And you learn a lot being a black girl in a white world. I didn't choose to go to an all-black college. Most of my siblings did. I didn't choose to live in a black community. Most of my siblings did. You know, I went to go work at IBM. Trust me. I got a major in math. Trust me. But inside myself, I've just been a black girl in a white world. And so when I have an opportunity, I share with people what that's like, if they care, if they're curious. And when I encounter something that doesn't feel fair and right, I speak up about it. So when I was at the 2016 gathering and a cop pulls up next to me and my partner while we're putting up our tent, doesn't roll down his windows, doesn't say hello, has the shaded windows, we couldn't see anybody, and he just sat there while we're putting up our tent. I felt intimidated, and I was not okay with it. And I was telling my partner at the time, I was like, you see how they have these little squares in the grass? You make sure that our tent is in the square. I don't want to be hassled by anybody. And she's like, come on, nobody's going to ask you about how you put up your tent. I said, we're putting the tent in the square. Well, she didn't, as usual. She put it a little outside the square because she said, I want the shade just so. And that's white privilege. I just will say that. So when I went to the pre-gathering and I heard other people saying, wait a minute, the cops were hassling you. They followed me when I went to go walk in the natural lands. What? They followed, and if 5 people told 5 different stories, and we'd only been there a day and a half. So something was wrong, and it got me upset. So it was just the straw on the camel's back when somebody said, oh, they want the black folks to sit up on the stage during the opening facing bench. And some folks who had been sort of pulled aside and were told that, they were taking that as an honor, right? I was asked. And then somebody else, well, you were asked? Well, I was asked. And then somebody else said, oh, we're all invited. And then all of a sudden, it didn't feel good, right? To be the token, the tokens, to make it look like we're more integrated than we are. It's like, what right do I have to sit up there? Nobody even knows me. I was like, Vanessa's been around. People know, yeah, that makes sense. I don't have any right to be sitting up there. I'm insulted that they would ask. So in people's attempt to try to, I guess, they think they're trying to do the right thing, but really it's a matter of having more conversation, right? It's a matter of really having some real conversation. And so when I heard that some folks were already looking at writing a petition, I went to a meeting. It was around a table outside, and it was all white folks around the table, but me. But people were having real conversation. Look, these things are not okay. Somehow we've got to break through this. And they had a petition that was rather, I would almost say violently worded, a couple of words. And some folks said, well, we'll stay after and help edit. And I just, I didn't have a choice. I always tell people, this must be what being led is. This must be what a calling is. I felt like I had no choice. I just need to ride this thing out. How can I help? Can I distribute petitions? Can I edit petitions? Can I make a Google form? Can I collect them? They can come to my house. I'll save the database. Whatever I can do. These are things I know how to do. I can do things I know how to do. I can help. Somebody said, you can co-clerk. Right? So you all know how that works, right? So that's how I got involved.
Well, I'm David Etheridge from Friends Meeting of Washington. I'm clerk of something called the Working Group on Racism for Baltimore Yearly Meeting, which has been going since 2002. I first became really aware of the issue.
David.
Down. Thank you. As a teenager, which in my case was at the beginning of the modern civil rights movement, the time of the Montgomery bus boycott and events following that, and school desegregation, the early stages of that. And that was just news in the newspaper and on television that I watched. It was no different from any other issue as far as I was concerned. I was in favor of desegregation and all that, but it was just nothing major with me. Until I went actually to Earlham College, freshman year. Initially, they were sending some students to Tougaloo College in Mississippi, a historically black college, and they were sending some students from Tougaloo up to Earlham. I was interviewed for going down there, and they decided that I would not be a good representative of Earlham. In retrospect, I see exactly how they came to that conclusion. But the students came up from that were my age, like 18, 19 years old, and talked to us about their experience and about segregation in their schools, in the theaters, in restaurants. And I could tell that it hurt them, that it wasn't just a technical thing. It wasn't just that that it was damaging, that they wouldn't have the contacts if they weren't integrated and that sort of thing. It was, they were hearing a message that I think was a message being sent, that we don't like you, we'd rather you weren't there, but if you are there, you're going to be separate from us, and you're going to be below us. There was always, the courts had said separate but equal, but everyone knew that wasn't how it was going to be, and even if it had been, as the Supreme Court said, it couldn't be. But that was the first time I realized that this is an issue about meanness, about harming people. Mostly, and it really didn't matter, there were plenty of people that meant harm, and there were plenty that didn't, but the harm was the same regardless. And a few years after that, I began to identify myself as a Quaker, and at that point, I wanted my community not to hurt people, not to cause damage. And it's pretty clear to me that, that there are a lot of folks, people of color, that find what we have to offer, our spirituality, of great value. And there are some that hang in there and show up and deal with what they have to deal with, but it's really how the white Quakers, we white Quakers behave, that keeps those numbers as low as they are. And so that's why I've become involved. I was not there in 2016. I wasn't on the institutional assessment that put the document together. I'm now signed on for the implementation part, and been told that, okay, now you make this thing, you and the other folks on the implementation team make this happen. So that's what I'm going to make an effort at.
So now we begin our conversation. And the first topic, we've chosen about 6, 7 topics that we will work through. The first one is, why do you think, we're going to talk to each other, why do you think people, especially white people, avoid the work of actively addressing racism? Why?
Because it's easy? Too easy. Right?
Yes. And I would probably argue that some of it is also obliviousness, right? Our society creates comfortability for white people. And until you've had that moment where you realize that it doesn't work the same way for everyone else, you're just oblivious. That people of color, other minorities, other folks off on the fringes don't live in that blissful place of complacency. I don't see it as a malicious thing, but as soon as you're aware of it, not starting to engage with it, to me, is a challenge and a problem. Because we live in a system that doesn't want white people to see the racism.
Yeah.
And once white people see it, the system makes it hard for white people to address. And so I have to be willing to step out of my comfort zone. I have to be willing to be in a hard place and be uncomfortable and in order to address it. And Carolyn, you said once that doing anti-racism work is like dental hygiene. and that has stuck with me because I don't enjoy flossing. But it's good for me. And it's, sometimes doing anti-racism work is hard. Often it's hard. And it's uncomfortable for all of us. But it's worth it. For me, it's worth it. And I hope for our community it is.
Yeah, it seems hard to me too. Part of it is, unless you realize there's a problem, then you're not going to do it because you don't have any reason to do it. But once you do, you have to face yourself, reflect on yourself, and then when you go from that reflection on yourself to trying to communicate that to other people, a lot of them are not that willing to hear it. I've kind of come to terms with that I'm going to be a pest, and I'm going to be perceived that way. A lot of people, that's a hard thing to accept in your own community, that you're going to be somebody that they try to avoid. And so,
kind of like John Woolman.
John Woolman is one example. Anthony Benezet.
Many.
There are many that actually have done the work, and they did have to be at home with having fewer friends, certainly, or fewer people willing to engage with them while they do that work. So that is that's part of what makes it difficult, and the self-reflection part never ends either. And continuing to be aware, or trying to be aware, or trying to continue that understanding is difficult as well.
My mother, David, one of her favorite things of saying when she couldn't solve a problem was saying, "Don't think about it, it will go away."
Oh, wow.
And so I think that's something that well-meaning white people do. I think that that Sharon and you, Vanessa, you wake up with it every day. You live it. I can choose. I can choose not to think about it. And I think a lot of my white brothers and sisters choose that. So here's one of the pushbacks that we get out of the work that we've done. Our FGC website declares, "Together we nurture the spiritual vitality of friends." And we hear a lot is, why is FGC using the work of becoming an anti-racist faith community instead of focusing on spiritual work?
I just can't be quiet on that one. Because it is spiritual work.
Thank you.
It is spiritual work. How's that? Is that better? I'm sorry to the sound guy. It is probably the most spiritual of the work that we can do in the culture that we live in today. I really don't have a whole lot more to say about it than that.
I can elaborate a little. It's, what I talked about, that self-reflection. Well, in the first place, I know that in the FGC Spiritual Deepening racism, anti-racism is a unit, and there's a reason for it, exactly what Sharon said. But there is a self-reflection. You need to have compassion for yourself. You also very much need to have compassion for other people to do it. And there's an accountability. You could not find, I don't think, in any of the masters of spiritual nurturing, of learning how to be, to deepen yourself spiritually, there's no practice that isn't part and helpful in doing anti-racism work. It's our nation's history has given us this exercise that and that will bring spiritual benefits for us, with respect, obviously, to trying to address the issue of racism, but it will be something that will be valuable in all parts of our lives.
So for me, Quakerism is a religion. And it's a religion in which we have testimonies, one of equality and one of integrity, and a belief that there is that of God in each person. So in the work that I do, I'm looking at God in each person. And I'm looking to my religious community to live into our testimonies of equality and integrity. And for us, if there is something that we're doing that is not just, that we are not living into that testimony, that in integrity, we need to be looking at why and what we need to do to be able to see and to treat all of us as that of God in each person. So it is very much spiritual work for me. It is all about spirit for me. And for my religious society, which I very much want to live into our testimonies.
Adding on to your idea of testimonies, it's my understanding that Quakers hold strong to the idea of community as a testimony and a way of practicing our faith. And we have a part of our community that's saying, ouch, this is a painful thing. We're not being welcoming. We're not creating equality. And so how do we become a whole community?
And even though I said I have nothing else to say on the topic, I do. And I guess it's more of a question, but if I can't come to my spiritual community and be seen as my whole self, completely fallible, completely lovable, then where? Where do I go?
I worry about my soul. As a white woman, I think my soul and the souls of white people are very wounded. And to get healthy, we have to do some really hard things. And we have to do things that maybe we don't want to do. and we have to find people that we can trust and get support from to do that work. So we've used some language up here tonight that some people resist, and language like white supremacy and decentering whiteness and critical kind of language. So how much does language really matter when we talk about becoming an anti-racist faith community?
Okay, I'm a mathematician, so, you know, you might think that I think language doesn't matter. Quite to the contrary, I think much of our thinking, I don't even know if there is thinking without language, much of our thinking is shaped by our language. When you think about at least I think about some of the Quakers I knew as I was growing up in New Jersey, and one of the things that I remembered about the Quakers in my community was language, different twist on language, which created for them sort of a closed community. In a loving family, hearing the parents refer to the children as I always thought that was so sweet. But as we move forward, we need to find new language. We need to find language that will help us with, I don't know why this microphone and I are not getting along. We need to find language that will help us with defining the difficulties we're having. So, I know some people get a little upset when they hear you talk about white supremacy. Or in their minds, they only see Charlottesville. And I say, oh, no, no, no. That's a distraction. White supremacy is inside of everybody. It's so woven into our culture that we don't know anything else but. It is white normalcy, white normity. White is right. Now, I was almost not going to say this, but I remember this phrase growing up. If you're black, get back. If you're brown, hang around. If you're white, you're all right. Now, I don't know where those things come from. And I don't even know if you've ever heard them. But the thing is, it's so woven into our culture that we live it. When we meet a person on the street and look them in the eye, it's how we look at them, how we move around them, how we approach them or not. It's so much woven in. And so it's unconscious. We try our best to remain unconscious because it's less unpleasant. So yes, white supremacy, there's a word that people have to struggle with and say, where is it in me? And I say me. Internalized racism. So there's a word. Another word that I think I really want to make an emphasis about is sort of the difference between being non-racist and anti-racist. So you get a lot of people say, well, you know, I'm not racist. I've never done any of those horrible things. Matter of fact, I'm non-racist. Some people say horrible things like, I don't even see color. And what's interesting, as we were working on that survey, and the three of us, actually, Katrina and Carolyn and I, we were the little mini survey team working on our questions. We were trying to work on language that would help us see some of these things that we hide so well. And what we said to ourselves, what FGC said to FGC, is, you know what? We'd like to pat ourselves on the back and say that we're non-racist. We'd like to do that, okay? But then in other questions later in the survey, when you ask them questions that are indicators of whether you're non-racist or anti-racist, doing actual action to do something about it, a lot of what the other kinds of questions answered were, well, you know, actually, when you do look around our meeting house, I guess all the pictures do look sort of white-centric, now that you mention it. There were other things that would be very indicative of, yeah, we're living in a white-centric world and we're not doing a darn thing about it. So we called ourselves out. That's the beauty of it, you know. It's not like somebody else had to come from outside of the Quakers had to come tell us. But we looked at ourselves critically and said, yeah, well, you know, now that you mention it, we do seem to have a lot of secret handshakes in our society, you know what I mean? Maybe it doesn't feel that welcoming that we all know the tricks of the trade and nobody else does. Maybe we need to think about our culture and in what ways are we using our culture to be exclusive and not welcoming. So yeah, language is very important.
Pause. So the university just told us that in the next 15 minutes there's going to be a hailstorm that will pass over. So we ask, we didn't do this, but a great way to keep our audience here. You know who did it. So anyway, avoid the hail.
Well, I will pass the baton.
Yeah, right. Our working group on racism in the Baltimore Yearly Meeting thinks about that sort of thing of what language will, and we do kind of we want things to move forward. We want people to listen and all that. For example, we started out, our first name was the Working Group on Racism Among Friends. And after a while, we actually backed off of that and just went with Working Group on Racism and not mentioning who. And then we were concerned. We saw it coming. We knew people had problems with the term racism itself, racist. And then all of a sudden we're hearing around us white supremacy, and we started worrying. We are, after all, Charlottesville is one of our meetings. But actually we've found that if you separate white supremacy from that it is not just what happened in Charlottesville and some other places, but it includes just simply the reality that in this country white people are in charge, that white is considered normal. That's hard to argue with, but it's crucial, it's important. So we've so we're using that regularly, and it's actually going, I think, better for us than racism. But it's very clear what it means when it includes more than Charlottesville.
What about white fragility? That's a term that has been used a lot. Robin DiAngelo has written a book about it. What makes white fragility hard to think about? I'm a burly girl. I'm not fragile.
Well, she talks about how she coined the term because she found that when she talked to people, they were defensive. They would deny that they had this problem.
I'm not a racist.
Exactly. And but if you teach somebody Spanish and you correct, you're pronouncing that wrong, they will accept it, generally speaking, because they want to learn the language. And so the idea is simply because there's a moral connotation, you feel that because you're not there yet by a long shot, that's something that you're a bad person. It actually it makes it harder to learn than it is to learn a language, and that's something the language teacher doesn't really have to deal with that much.
So maybe a piece of our white supremacy culture is that we all want to be thought of as good people.
Yeah, and the good-bad binary, that's on our list.
Yeah.
That actually connoting it as good and bad as a problem makes it impossible to makes it harder to address because people are so busy denying it they're not in the process of learning how to address it.
Mm-hmm. I think fear also feeds into that. And my own immediate personal example is that when I was asked to sit on this panel, I was terrified. I think I'm still a little terrified. Not because I don't want people to know that I'm involved and invested in this work, but because I'm afraid of not doing it well and perfectly, that I'm afraid of being on stage in front of my community and screwing up. And to me, that's whiteness showing up, that I'm afraid that if I'm not perfect, that if I say the wrong thing, that it would be better I not do it. And so these 4 people up here today and a number of other folks helped me step into a brave place to do this work and to be here tonight. But for me, it was all about feeling fragile and scared in terms of wondering if I could do it, because I feel like where I am in my journey is not near as impressive and as far along as other people on this stage and other people in our community. And what I've learned along the way is the fact that I'm trying and being on this journey and open to hearing that I'm making mistakes is the important part, and that I'm learning and learning and making mistakes and learning.
And for me, the importance of learning is the ability to listen. And so in bridging that into language, when I became a member of my meeting in Philadelphia, we had a committee that was the Overseers Committee. I had no idea what it did, but I knew that I would never be a part of it. And I talked with some folks in my meeting about how disturbing it was for me that Quakers had an Overseers Committee. And they tried to explain what it did and that, it was good, it was taking care of members of the meeting. And I said, I don't care. It's a word that denotes hierarchy. It's a word that denotes oppression. And I was fortunate that there were some members of my meeting who heard that. And they, being European Americans, took it to business meeting. And said, we've been talking with some folks and among ourselves and find that we're not comfortable with this term. And my meeting said, I hear that, and we hear some of the challenges with this, and changed the name of the committee to Membership Care, which was very transparent because many people came into the meeting going, well, what is this Overseers Committee? But people come in the meeting now and see that one of the committees they can serve on is membership care. So not only did just changing the words, did it take away some of the negative connotations that it came with, but it also made it clearer what the group was doing. But there was resistance to it. There was resistance in, wait, this is a part of our heritage, this is a part of our history, this is who we are, this is Quakerism. And, you know, some of us pushed back and said, and so is continuing revelation. And and maybe we've used this term as long as we're supposed to use this term, and it's time to lay it down and replace it with something else.
Lay that sword down.
Amen.
White culture comes from European culture, and Quakers come from European culture. A plus B equals, yeah. Okay, one of our, we've talked about our Quaker testimony of equality, and one of the places that we, in this work that we get pushback is when we create separate spaces for people of color at Gathering, or in workshops, or in the retreats that we do. So why is that so important?
It's a respite. And I even have to ask myself back in 2016, if I was experiencing something on my own dealing with the cops, and I had no way of sharing that story with other folks who were experiencing the same thing, that I would sort of listen to my white partner who said, you know, it's all in your head, you know, just let it go, it's going to be all right. And you can do some of that. You have to do some of that just to stay sane. But when you're hearing it and the bell keeps ringing and it keeps ringing and it keeps ringing, so, okay, I can't ignore this bell. So that's one reason, to be with people of like mind.
Like experience.
And experiences.
And clearly like experience. But also just to have the respite. So I shared a little bit about my life, but pretty much I live as a black person in a white world everywhere I go, where I work, where I live, where I eat, where I sleep, everywhere. Where, clearly where we worship. So it's so sweet. I think probably the first time is I went to a training on helping people read through Fit for Freedom, Not for Friendship. So we went to Philly, a bunch of people were going there, we're gonna learn some good groovy stuff from the UNO span, and come back to our meetings and we're gonna read through your book. And we were all cool with that, right? But late at night, a few black women sat in this tiny little room and just talked, and then had worship. Sweetest worship I ever experienced. That was the first time when I sat in worship with all black folks. Beautiful. 2006-ish. So the next time was when I went to Gathering and went to the People of Color Center, and then some of it is people of color in their families, so a lot of us are in blended families, that's cool. And then they separate us, right? And then we have some time with just black folks. Very sweet worship. And so what is it? It's a respite. All of a sudden, I'm just Sharon. I'm just a Quaker. I'm not a black Quaker. I'm just a Quaker. Having worship, feeling the Spirit, listening, waiting. Beautiful. There's a little tiny, you might not be able to see it, but there's a little tiny film. It's like a wall that black people carry around with them through most of their life. They develop it very young, and it's to protect them from all the weird stuff that people are going to do to you. Like standing in line to get your food, and somebody coming over and grabbing your hair and say, "How do you wash that?" That happened to me at 2016 Gathering. Stuff. If you don't have that little invisible protective shield, it can really hurt. It does really hurt anyway, but somehow you've learned to kind of control it, at least not fall down and out in front of people. So, respite. First word comes out of my mouth. I can just be Sharon. And you can look at me and you can say, "Oh, here comes Sharon with her stuff." And that would be great. Because you're just going to see my stuff. Just because I'm Sharon. That same stuff my parents saw, same stuff my sisters and brothers see. But other people can't see me because they first see the package somehow. So when do we get beyond that? And until we were able to do that, and I think, I regretfully say, that even though I thought the times were changing, you know, back in my high school days when I fell in love with my current partner and believed that everybody else was going to be like us, that we were just going to let that stuff go, that you go out in the world, and there are too many of those experiences over too many years, and that little thin film, in order to make it, it gets thicker, and it gets thicker, and it gets thicker. And so that optimistic kid becomes a little more pessimistic about this ever going to change. How's it ever going to change? And experiencing the culture we've been experiencing for the last 2 years, whew. So thank you for the People of Color Center. And thank you for not coming in there.
So I do want to clarify that you can come in there.
At certain times.
But not between 4:30 and 5:30 every day, and then tonight at 9:15. But all the other times, you're welcome to come in. Oh, and not doing the morning when we're doing our workshop. So, but, so for me, one of the ways I want to answer your question is, why are we here? Why do we have FGC Gathering? Why is gathering important to us? Because as Quakers, we want to come together and be together with each other in community and leave the stuff from the outside world outside. That's why we, as Friends of Color, want to come together. Because we also want to leave that outside, but as Sharon has shared, that we have experiences here in this community that are just like outside. And so we need opportunities to come together, one, to rest, two, to be able to release the stuff that has been coming at us so that we don't get very, well, sometimes we do. We did in 2016. But if we can release it and share it with each other, it helps. Then I know I'm a better person when I'm in larger community. It also, you know, for me, I think that I was the first, with my husband, African American on campus in 2016, and was the first person to experience the profiling by the police. And when that happened, I happened to have been by myself. And so it was a moment of, did that really happen? And I kept that to myself until another friend of color said to me, hey, this just happened. And I was like, that happened to you? So sometimes in society and in community, things happen to me as an African American woman that I want to believe was not intentional. Person had no idea really what they were doing. But when I start talking with other friends of color and find that actually they are having similar experiences, that it is a pattern, then it is a part of the system, then it needs to be addressed. But if I don't have the other friends of color around me to help me see that it's a pattern, then I'm stuck in isolation and still feeling it's just happening to me. So having that space is important. We wouldn't have had the institutional cultural assessment without having the pre-gathering retreat, where we had for years built up communities and relationships and had time to come together and share the common experiences that we were having. So that's part of the reason that I push for us to have some spaces that are just for people of color. And as I said, it's just 4:30 to 5:30, Monday through Friday. That other times, you're very welcome and we want you to come into the center. We want you to participate in the programs that we're having. We want you to also get a respite and be read to. Have the moment of going back to childhood and having somebody read you a story, which is on Friday at 3:15 at the People of Color Center.
I'm sorry, I misspoke.
You didn't misspeak.
So I had a follow-up question, but I'm going to go on to the next topic. How does our adherence to Quaker practice support white supremacy within our faith? I'll give you an example. Or you can speak. Sorry, go ahead.
It's my experience that we have a lot of unspoken, unwritten expectations and rules as part of our Quaker practice. And that lack of transparency, that kind of situation that creates a inner circle, people in the know, people out of the know, to me, is a perpetuation of white supremacy culture, who has the power to make an exception to the rule or selectively enforce those rules. Who shuts something down, not on the floor, but before it gets there, or, right? Like there's so much navigating that happens, and so all of that to me is actually not necessarily our Quaker faith, but it's our Quaker culture. And so how do we get rid of that Quaker culture to actually get to our Quaker faith and practice?
Some of the parts of Quaker faith that I'm so drawn to is seeing that of God in everyone, seeing the light that everyone carries. We're working to see it sometime, but it's what a beautiful way to live your life, right? It's so simple. And another thing that I find to be so sweet is worship, obviously. How could you not? But at least in our little Cannon Valley Friends meeting, sometimes the meeting is so gathered, it's like we're all one. So sweet. And we're listening, we're waiting. We want to hear how we should move. What's the next move? Where are we being led? What should we do? To me, that's so simple. I know Vanessa oftentimes reminds me, now don't forget, there's continuing revelation. But there's really not that much there. That's what I think is so beautiful. There's no great dogma, there's no great credo. We come with our curiosity, we seek truth. I'm so drawn to that, the simplicity of this religion. And then, there are all these other sort of unwritten rules and ways and tricks, and you know, there's an unseen hierarchy when I'm looking for something that's sort of egalitarian. And what happened? It's like when you start looking carefully, you see something very different. And it's all this man-made stuff that we pack on top of this very simple Quaker faith.
Can I add to that? It's a
I'm
yeah,
sure
but.
you will.
Here's my but. So we're in a gathered meeting for worship, and it's really sweet. And someone stands up and tells a story where they use the N-word. And I know it's happened in my meeting, and I know it's happened in other meetings.
Ain't happened in my meeting yet. Serious.
So we are taught as Quaker practice not to respond to somebody else's message. You know, do I, as someone who cares about practicing anti-racism, forget the Quaker tradition of not addressing something that's said in worship?
Yes, sometime you need to stand up, that's right.
And I have heard stories. I mean, we know I'm bold. I've told someone to be quiet today, so we know that. But I know, I've heard stories of other meetings that people don't know what to do. It's easy to say, now, stand up. It's easy to say that. But in the moment, as a white person, I'm kind of in shock. I kind of look around the room to see, you know, how people are taking it in. I don't know what to say. I, of course, afterward think about 3 things I could have said. So that is one of the practices, not to respond to somebody else's message, that may get in the way of us practicing anti-racism.
I'm sorry, but I'm sure that I would be led to speak on that.
And good for you, Sharon, but you shouldn't be the one that has to.
No, I shouldn't. I shouldn't.
It should be me or David or Katrina. Right.
But you may not be able to speak before me.
And I wouldn't want to take your voice away.
So another tradition that we experienced at Central Committee is when the task force presented their report, we had a minute in it that we wanted passed. And what happened, Sharon?
It got passed.
Well, it didn't get passed right away, honey. No.
It took a minute.
It took 15 or 20 minutes of wordsmithing. And then our clerk sent those of us who worked on it away to work on the wordsmithing. And what did we do there?
So we ain't gonna change it.
That's right. We said we were not going to change it, and we didn't change it. But what we did do was then take the concerns that Friends had raised and explained where that was actually already addressed in our minute when we came back and said we were not changing it, and why.
And the clerk, who was very articulate, the co-clerk, stood up and said, this is an example of white supremacy. You give us this task to go and dream and create something really big, and all you want to do is put it in the existing box so that we feel comfortable with it, so that you feel comfortable with it. And it was a moment, it was a stunning moment at Central Committee, I'm sure many of you were there, of pause about understanding white supremacy in action.
It was as if someone had taken the mirror and put it up in front of FGC Central Committee, and they said, oh my goodness, look at ourselves.
Yeah. So other practices, I mean, there's speaking out in addressing a message that's disturbing. There's looking at our business practice. There's looking at hierarchy and who speaks. Is there anything else I'm sure there is.
There's a lot.
Say what?
Membership.
Membership. Ah, now there's white supremacy.
And a lot of...
Repeat them.
Membership and conflict avoidance.
Nominating.
Nominating.
Ding, 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 ding.
David.
There's a lot of that comes, I think, from the concept of Quakerliness. What people do is they perform anthropology on themselves, and they say, we do this, we behave this way, we're Quakers, therefore this must be Quakerly. And
circular logic on that one.
and when most of the folks are white, that Quakerliness is going to be white culture.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it qualifies as a practice, but the whitewashing of our history. And my query to that is, having had a discussion with a friend and mentor today, was can we embrace the bad parts of our history as a reminder to us that it is possible that we can be in that place of having done bad, wrong, hard things.
Our history is very important, and looking at it in its completeness and not just in the good parts that we want to remember. I know when Donna McDaniel and I were doing the research for Fit for Freedom, and I was shocked at some of the things that I learned in doing that research. And I remember saying to our editor that when our book comes out, that it's like, are there going to be therapists that are going to be there and available? Because, you know, that's why we have the myth of racial justice as a part of the title, because there are so many things, you know. Yes, I know that John Woolman was going around and talking to folks and trying to get them to not enslave people of African descent, and it's, wait, who was he talking to? He was talking to Quakers. So what? What did that mean about Quakers? That they enslaved people of African descent. Wait, but they were abolitionists. How were they enslavers? You know, that all is important. The fact that Quaker meetings got closed to abolitionists and abolitionist meetings. What, wait? So that for me was a shock to learn that. To learn that the head of the Ku Klux Klan in Indiana was a Quaker woman was also shocking for me. And there are many other things that I can list. So I knew the emotions that I was experiencing about what, Quakers? And that's not what I learned about Quakers. I learned that Quakers were abolitionists and part of the civil rights movement, and so where is this coming from? And it was coming from something, the passive aggressiveness of not wanting to admit that, yes, that we as a religious society have in many ways participated in society in general.
And still do.
And still do. Very much still do. And that one of the blessings for me in doing the research and writing Fit for Freedom, excuse me, was being introduced to the Quakers who stood up and said, this practice is wrong, starting in 1688, and seeing the variety of ways Quakers followed their ministry. Some, like the Friends in 1688, they made a statement, they were done. They didn't do anything else. There were others, like Anthony Benezet, who went on for the rest of his life and did work, as John Woolman did. But they all made important contributions, and their contributions, had they not made them, don't know, it may have taken us much longer as a religious society than in 1776 to stop enslaving people of African descent. So that we all can take a role. We all have parts that we need to be doing. And if you're feeling a nudge from God to say, okay, to your meeting, hey, I feel I might have this ministry, and can you put together a committee, a clears committee, to help us discern if I really do have this? And then a support committee to help me be able to go forward with my ministry, as my meeting has done for me.
One thing that this assessment has done for Religious Society of Friends is start conversations in local meetings, and it's building. And let's talk about, we've got maybe about 5 more minutes that we can until we have to go to the end of this. What kind of things are meetings doing right now to further bring this work to the local, their local meeting?
What could they do, or what are they doing?
Either. What could they, or what are they?
We're just starting some conversations in our meeting. Of course, after the institutional assessment, we came back, we had adult forums, we talked about what happened there, et cetera, and so forth. It hasn't become yet a sort of a big movement in my own home meeting. But I know at least one member of my meeting who's been asking questions. So what can we do? Getting some resources, putting it together, and we're in conversation about taking this on as a meeting as our focus over the next year. Now, to me, a year is not enough. But for someone, not me, in my meeting to be saying, where can I get the resources, what can we do, and can we take this on? For me, personally, that was music to my ears. Because I don't think that they'll put it down at the end of a year either. I think once people decide, okay, we're going to have some adult forums that are just going to center around, reading the recommendations that came out of the institutional assessment. Let's see, are any of those anything like what we're doing at our meetings? Should we just take this one and rewrite it and put it, Cannon Valley Friends meeting on it, and we'll work on it? Or, hey, maybe there's some of those themes that came out of the assessment. I mean, are we transparent in our decision making? Are we fully welcoming in our meeting to people who are other than us? Do we have a hierarchical structure? What does that look like? Do people know how to get on committees? And what up with nominating anyway? Because, if they don't know you, they're not going to ask you. And isn't there something sort of insular about that process? How do we get new people involved? What kind of jobs do we have that new people can do without even being around very long? So there's so many things. I think once we take that first step of saying we want to do it, the resources are unlimited. So we can start with the assessment, but there are movies, there are books. If you like, there are articles. I ran across a recent Communication and Religion is the name of the journal, and the spring 2018 issue just deals with race and religion in the country. And the one is about Dr. Martin Luther King and what a bad, oh, I'm not allowed to say that, what a bad dude he was. They really treat him as more from his activist perspective. A lot of people like to think of him as the kumbaya guy, but he liked to stir things up.
Yes, he did.
So a very different perspective in that article. So there are things out there, you don't have to do much more than scratch the surface, and you'll find all kinds of resources and ways that you can sort of self-educate in your meeting.
And you can scratch that surface right on the FGC website. And among one of the pages there is what our yearly meeting's doing. You can find out what other yearly meetings are doing. If you go to Baltimore yearly meeting, there will be a list of 32 ideas of things you can do. Something that's not on that list because we didn't think of it is that sort of thing, is our yearly meeting asks each meeting to have its members and attenders self-identify. It's whether they were people of color or white or that sort of thing. And just the conversations that started was really moved things forward in a really good way. So you can try that.
That self-identification of members and attenders of the meeting is really something I applaud your meeting for doing. Today, there's a professor here on campus, an African-American woman who came to the People of Color Center, and she asked, well, how many Quakers of color are there? And I said, I cannot tell you. We don't keep those statistics. We can tell you that the majority of Quakers are actually of color because the largest number of Quakers we do know are in Africa and then in Latin America. But in the United States and in Canada, we don't maintain our records that way. And I would like to see us start doing that.
Our time is coming to a close right now, so I need to do some advertising. Okay. So the FGC website has resources around combating racism, challenging racism. Oh, there it is.
Is her name?
No. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Okay, there it is. Challenging racism. There is the Spiritual Deepening program has an e-retreat that they do once a year, and it is in September.
September 22nd.
And there is September, right? And then there is also one on being a welcoming community that Katrina was talking about, and that is in November. And that is on the website also. And there are in front of you in the pews postcards that say, together we confront and heal the wounds of systemic racism. There are two kinds. One has some text on it, and you can address it to meetings that you know or send them to people that you want to know with a text on it. There's also another one without any text that you can write little notes, and we really encourage you to send them to your friends and people in meeting. It's a powerful message. Together we confront and heal the wounds of systemic racism. There are more opportunities to talk about this. What we decided to do tonight in our presentation is just a little picture of the conversations the five of us had over the last 2-3 months about, oh my gosh, now that we're doing this plenary, what are we going to do? And we found ourselves in deep conversation during each of our bi-weekly and then weekly meetings. So we hope that this has inspired you to join us in making the Religious Society Friends truly an anti-racist faith community. Thank you very much.